rigid. Socialism would be in industry what a rigid, instinctive equipment is in animals. It would produce a community of human ants and bees, and would issue in a slavery far more monotonous and hopeless than the present condition of affairs. Under the compulsory arbitration which socialism would necessitate the regulators pursuing their personal interests would not be met by the combined resistance of all workers and their power unchecked as now by refusals to work save on prescribed terms would grow and ramify and consolidate until it became irresistible. When from regulation of the worker by the bureaucracy, we turn to the bureaucracy itself and ask how it is to be regulated. There is no satisfactory answer. Under such conditions, there must arise a new aristocracy for the support of which the masses would toil, and which, being consolidated, would wield a power far beyond that of any past aristocracy. Economic relationships are so different from political relationships and are so much more complex that no government could regulate them all without such an enslaving bureaucracy. State interference always neglects some factor of the intricate industrial situation and has failed whenever tried. Note the wage fixing laws of medieval England and the price fixing of Revolution France. Economic relations must be left to the automatic self adjustment, imperfect though it may be, of supply and demand. What society most wants, it will pay for most heavily, and if certain men or certain functions receive great rewards, it is because they have taken or have involved exceptional risks or pains. Men as now constituted will not tolerate a compulsory equality until an automatically changed environment automatically changes human character. Legislation enacting artificial changes will be as futile as astrology. Spencer was almost made sick by the thought of a world ruled by the wage earning class. He was not enamored of trade union leaders so far as he could know them through the refractory medium of the London Times. He pointed out that strikes are useless unless most strikes failed, for it all workers should, at various times, strike and win. Social statistics prices would presumably rise in accord with the raised wages, and the situation would be as before. We shall presently see the injustices once inflicted by the employee classes paralleled by the injustices inflicted by the employed classes. Nevertheless, his conclusions were not blindly conservative. He realized the chaos and the brutality of the social system that surrounded him, and he looked about with evident eagerness to find a substitute. In the end, he gave his sympathies to the cooperative movement. He saw in this the culmination of that passage from status to contract in which Sir Henry Mand had found the essence of economic history. The regulation of labor becomes less coercive as society assumes a higher type. Here we reach a form in which the coerciveness has diminished to the smallest degree consistent with combined action. Each member is his own master in respect of the work he does, and is subject only to such rules established by majority of the members as are needful for maintaining order. The transition from the compulsory cooperation of militancy to the voluntary cooperation of industrialism is completed. He doubts if human beings are yet honest and competent enough to make so democratic a system of industry efficient, but he is all for trying. He foresees a time when industry will no longer be directed by absolute masters, and men will no longer sacrifice their lives in the production of rubbish, as the contrast between the militant and the industrial types is indicated by inversion of the belief that individuals exist for the benefit of the state into the belief that the state exists for the benefit of individuals. So the contrast between the industrial type and the type likely to be evolved from it is indicated by inversion of the belief that life is for work into the belief that work is for life. This ethics, the evolution of morals. So important document. This problem of industrial reconstruction seemed to Spencer that he devoted to it again the largest section of the Principles of Ethics, 1893. This last part of my task, to which I regard all the preceding parts as subsidiary, as a man with all the moral severity of the mid Victorian. Spencer was especially sensitive to the problem of finding a new and natural ethic to replace the moral code which had been associated with the traditional faith. The supposed supernatural sanctions of right conduct do not, if rejected, leaves a blank. There exists natural sanctions no less preemptory and covering a much wider field. The new morality must be built upon biology, acceptance of the doctrine of organic evolution, determines certain ethical conceptions. Huxley, in his Romans lectures at Oxford in 1893, argued that biology could not be taken as an ethical guide, that nature read in tooth and claw, as Tennyson was phrasing it, exalted brutality and cunning rather than justice and love, but Spencer felt that a moral code which could not meet the tests of natural selection and the struggle for existence was from the beginning doomed to lip service and futility. Conduct, like anything else, should be called good or bad as it is well adapted or maladapted to the ends of life. The highest conduct is that which conduces to the greatest length, breadth, and completeness of life. Or, in terms of the evolution formula, conduct is moral according as it makes the individual or the group more integrated and coherent in the midst of a heterogeneity of ends. Morality, like art, is the achievement of unity in diversity. The highest type of man is he who effectively unites in himself the widest variety, complexity, and completeness of life. This is a rather vague definition, as it must be, for nothing varies so much from place to place and from time to time as the specific necessities of adaptation, and therefore the specific content of the idea of good. It is true that certain forms of behavior have been stamped as good and adapted in the large to the fullest life by the sense of pleasure which natural selection has attached to these preservative and expansive actions. The complexity of modern life has multiplied exceptions, but normally pleasure indicates biologically useful and pain indicates biologically dangerous activities. Nevertheless, within the broad bounds of the principle, we find the most diverse and apparently the most hostile conceptions of the good. There is hardly any item of our Western moral code which is not somewhere held to be immoral, not only polygamy but suicide, murder of one's own countrymen, even of one's parents, finds in one people or another a lofty moral approbation. The wives of the Fijian chiefs considered it a sacred duty to suffer strangulation on the death of their husbands. A woman who had been rescued by Williams escaped during the night and swimming across the river and presenting herself to her own people, insisted on the completion of the sacrifice, which she had, in a moment of weakness, reluctantly consented to forego. And weeks tells of another who loaded her rescuer with abuse and ever afterwards manifested the most deadly hatred towards him. Livingstone says of the Makololo women on the shores of the Zambesi that they were quite shocked to hear that in England a man had only one wife. To have only one was not respectable So, too, in Equatorial Africa, according to Reid, if a man marries and his wife thinks that he can afford another spouse, she prefers him to marry again and calls him a stingy fellow if he declines to do so. Such facts, of course, conflict with the belief that there is an inborn moral sense which tells each man what is right and what is wrong, but the association of pleasure and pain on the average with good or evil conduct indicates a measure of truth in the idea and may very well be that certain moral conceptions acquired by the race become hereditary, hereditary with the individual. So here Spencer uses his favorite formula to reconcile the intuitionist and the utilitarian and falls back once more upon the inheritance of acquired characters. Surely, however, the innate moral sense, if it exists, is in difficulties today, for never were ethical notions more confused. It is notorious that the principles which we apply in our actual living are largely opposite to those which we preach in our churches, in our books. The professed ethic of Europe and America is a pacifistic Christianity. The actual ethic is the militaristic code of the marauding Teutons, from whom the ruling strata almost everywhere in Europe are derived. The practice of dueling in Catholic France and Protestant Germany is a tenacious relic of the original Teutonic code. Our moralists are kept busy apologizing for these contradictions, just as the moralists of a later monogamic Greece and India were hard put to it to explain the conduct of gods who had been fashioned in a semi promiscuous age. Whether a nation develops its citizens on the lines of Christian morality or the Teutonic code depends on whether industry or war is its dominant concern. A militant society exalts certain virtues and condones what other peoples might call crimes. Aggression and robbery and treachery are not so unequal unequivocally denounced among peoples accustomed to them by war, as among peoples who have learned the value of honesty and non-aggression through industry and peace. Generosity and humanity flourish better where war is infrequent and long periods of productive tranquility inculcate the advantages of mutual aid. The patriotic member of a militant society will look upon bravery and strength as the highest virtues of a man, upon obedience as the highest virtue of the citizen, and upon silent submission to multiple motherhood as the highest virtue of a woman. The Kaiser thought of God as the leader of the German army and followed up his approbation of dueling by attending divine service. The North American Indians regarded the use of the bow and arrow, the war club, and the spear as the noblest employments of man. They looked upon agricultural and mechanical labor as degrading. Only during recent times, only now that national welfare is becoming more and more dependent on superior powers of production, and these on the higher mental faculties are other occupations than militant ones rising into respectability. Now, war is merely wholesale cannibalism, and there is no reason why it should not be classed with cannibalism and unequivocally denounced. The sentiment and the idea of justice can grow only as fast as the external antagonisms of society decrease, and the internal harmonious cooperations of their members increase. How can this harmony be promoted? As we have seen, it comes more readily through freedom than through regulation. The formula of justice should be every man is free to do that which he willed, provided he infringes not the equal freedom of any other man. This is a formula hostile to war, which exalts authority, regimentation, and obedience. It is formulas favorable to peaceful industry, for it provides a maximum of stimulus with an absolute equality of opportunity. It is conformable to Christian morals, for it holds every person sacred and frees him from aggression, and it has the sanction of that ultimate judge, natural selection, because it opens up the resources of the earth on equal terms to all and permits each individual to prosper according to his ability and his work. This may seem at first to be a ruthless principle, and many will oppose to it as capable of national extension. The family principle of giving to each not according to his ability and product, but according to his need. But a society governed on such principles would soon be eliminated. During immaturity, benefits received must be inversely proportionate to capacities possessed. Within the family group, most must be given where least is deserved. If desert is measured by worth, contrariwise, after maturity is reached, benefit must vary directly as worth. Worth being measured by fitness to the conditions of existence. The ill-fitted must suffer the evils of unfitness, and the well-fitted profit by their fitness. These are the two laws which a species must conform to if it is to be preserved. If among the young benefit were proportioned to efficiency, the species would disappear forthwith, and if among adults benefit were proportioned to inefficiency, the species would disappear by decay in a few generations. The only justification for the analogy between parent and child and the government and the people is the childishness of the people who entertained the analogy. Liberty contends with evolution for priority in Spencer's affections, and liberty wins. He thinks that as war decreases, the control of the individual by the state loses most of its excuse, and in a condition of permanent peace, the state would be reduced within Jeffersonian bounds, acting only to prevent breaches of equal freedoms. Such justice should be administered without cost, so that wrongdoers might know that the poverty of their victims would not shield them from punishment, and all the expenses of the state should be met by direct taxation, lest the invisibility of taxation should divert public attention from governmental extravagance. But beyond maintaining justice, the state cannot do anything else without transgressing justice, for it would then be protecting inferior individuals from that natural apportionment of reward and capacity, penalty and incapacity on which the survival and the improvement of the group depend. The principle of justice would require common ownership of land. If we could separate the land from its improvements. In his first book, Spencer had advocated nationalization of the soil to equalize economic opportunity, but he withdrew his contention later, much to the disgust of Henry George, who called him the perplexed philosopher, on the ground that land is carefully husbanded only by the family that owns it, and that can rely on transmitting to its own descendants the effects of the labor put into it. As for private property, it derives immediately from the law of justice, for each man should be equally free to retain the products of his thrift. The justice of bequests is not so obvious, but the right to bequeath is included in the right of ownership. Since otherwise the ownership is not complete, trade should be as free among nations as among individuals. The law of justice should be no merely tribal code, but an inviolable maxim of international relations. These are, in outline, the real rights of man, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness on equal terms with all. Besides this, economic rights, political rights are unimportant unrealities. Changes in the form of government amount to nothing where economic life is not free. And laissez-faire monarchy is much better than a socialistic democracy, voting being simply a method of creating an appliance for the preservation of rights. The question is whether universality of votes conduces to creation of the best appliance for the preservation of rights. We have seen that it does not effectually secure this end. Experience makes obvious that which should have been obvious without experience, that with the universal distribution of votes, the larger class will inevitably profit at the expense of the smaller class. Evidently, the constitution of the state appropriate to that industrial type of society in which equity is fully realized must be one in which there is not a representation of individuals but a representation of interests. It may be that the industrial type, perhaps by the development of cooperative organization, which theologically, though not at present practically, obliterate the distinction between employer and employed, make produce social arrangements under which antagonistic class interests will either not exist or will be so far mitigated as not serious to complicate matters. But with such humanity as now exists, there must for a long time exist the possession of what are called equal rights will not ensure the maintenance of equal rights properly so called, since political rights are a delusion and only economic rights availed. Women are misled when they spend so much time seeking the franchise. Spencer fears that the material, the maternal instinct for helping the helpless may lead women to favor a parentalistic state. This is some confusion in his mind. On this point, he argues that political rights are of no importance, and then that is very important that women should not have them. He denounces war and then contends that women should not vote because they do not risk their lives in shameful argument for any man to use who has been born of a woman's suffering. He is afraid of women because they may be too altruistic, and yet the culminating conception of his book is that industry and peace will develop altruism to the point where it will balance egoism and so evolve the spontaneous order of a philosophic anarchism. The conflict of egoism and altruism, this word, And something of this line of thought Spencer takes more or less unconsciously from Comte results from the conflict of the individual with his family, his group, and his race. Presumably, egoism will remain dominant, but perhaps that is desirable if everybody thought more of the interests of others than of his own. We should have a chaos of courtesies and retreats, and probably the pursuit of individual happiness within the limits prescribed by social condition is the first requisite to the attainment of the greatest general happiness. What we may expect, however, is a great enlargement of the sphere of sympathy, a great development of the impulses to altruism, even not the sacrifice entailed by parentage are gladly made. The wish for children among the childless, and the occasional adoption of children show how needful for the attainment of certain egoistic satisfactions are these altruistic activities. The intensity of patriotism is another instance of the passionate preference of larger interests to one's immediate concerns. Every generation of social living deepens the impulses to mutual unceasing social discipline will so mold human nature that eventually sympathetic pleasures will be spontaneously pursued to the fullest extent, advantageous to all. The sense of duty, which is the echo of generations of compulsion to social behavior, will then disappear. Altruistic actions have become instinctive through their natural selection for social unity, will, like every instinctive operation, be performed without compulsion and with joy. The natural evolution of human society brings us ever nearer to the perfect state. The intelligent reader, in the course of this brief analysis, will have perceived certain difficulties in the argument, and will need no more than some scattered reminders as to where the imperfection lie. Negative criticism is always unpleasant, and most so in the face of great achievement. But it is part of our task to see what time has done to Spencer's synthesis. The first obstacle, of course, is the unknowable. We may cordially recognize the probable limitations of human knowledge. We cannot quite fathom that great sea of existence of which we are merely a transient wave. But we must not dogmatize on the subject, since in strict logic and assertion that anything is knowable already implies some knowledge of the thing. Indeed, as Spencer proceeds through his 10 volumes, he shows a prodigious knowledge of the unknown. The analysis, of course, is incomplete. Space forbids. The author has often smiled at this cloak for laziness, but must offer it here. A discussion of the education, the essays, and large sections of the sociology. The lesson of the education has been too well learned, and we require today some corrective of Spencer's victorious assertion of the claims of science, us, against letters and the arts. Of the essays, the best are those on style, laughter, and music. Who Eliot's Herbert Spencer is an admirable exposition, as Hegel put it, to limit. Reason by reasoning is like trying to swim without entering the water, and all this logic chopping about inconceivability. How far away that seems to us now, how like those sophomoric days when to be alive was to debate. And for that matter, an unguided machine is not much more conceivable than a first cause, particularly if by this latter phrase we mean the sum total of all causes and forces in the world. Spencer, living in a world of machines, took mechanism for granted, just as Darwin, living in an age of ruthless individual competition, saw only the struggle for existence. What shall we say of that tremendous definition of evolution? Does it explain anything? To say, first there was the simple, and then the complex was evolved out of it, and so on, is not to explain nature. Spencer says Bergson repeats, he does not explain. He misses as he at last perceives the vital element in the world. The critics evidently have been irritated by the definition. Is Latinized English is especially arresting in a man who denounced the study of Latin and defined a good style as that which requires the least effort of understanding. Something must be conceded to Spencer. However, no doubt he chose to sacrifice immediate clarity to the need of concentrating in a brief statement the flow of our existence. But in truth, he is a little too fond of his definition. He rolls it over his tongue like a choice morsel and takes it apart and puts it together again inter- interminably. Interminably. The weak point of the definition lies in the supposed instability of the homogeneous. Is a whole composed of like parts, more unstable, more subject to change than the whole composed of unlike parts. The heterogeneous as more complex would presumably be more unstable than the homogeneously simple. In ethnology and politics, it is taken for granted that heterogeneity makes for instability and that the fusion of immigrant stocks into one national type would strengthen a society. Trade thinks that civilization results from an increase of similarity among the members of a group through generations of mutual imitation. Here, the movement of evolution is conceived as a progress towards homogeneity. Gothic architecture is surely more complex than that of the Greeks, but not necessarily a higher stage of artistic evolution. Spencer was too quick to assume that what was earlier in time was simpler in structure. He underrated the complexity of protoplasm and the intelligence of primitive man. Finally, the definition fails to mention the very item which in most minds today is inalienably associated with the idea of evolution, namely natural selection. Perhaps perfect though this too would be, a description of history as a struggle for existence and a survival of the fittest organisms. The fittest societies, the fittest moralities, the fittest languages, ideas, philosophies would be more illuminating than the formula in coherence and coherence of homo and heterogeneity of dissipation and integration. I am a bad observer of humanity in the concrete, says Spencer, being too much given to wandering into the abstract. This is dangerous honesty. Spencer's method, of course, was too deductive and a priori very different from Bacon's ideals or the actual procedure of scientific thought. He had, says his secretary, an inexhaustible faculty of developing a priori and a posteriori, inductive and deductive arguments in support of any imaginable proportion. And the a priori arguments were probably prior to the others. Spencer began like a scientist with observation. He proceeded like a scientist to make hypotheses, but then, unlike a scientist, he resorted not to experiment nor to impartial observation, but to the selective accumulation of favorable data. He had no nose at all for negative instances. Contrast the procedure of Darwin. Today's work is over.